What have you guys talked about in the past?
We've been doing this daily, I guess since March, well, about a month now, 5 days
Wow.
a week. Uh, Mostly gardening topics, but we've thrown in, I think once we had pasture management and a few other odds and ends, beekeeping, pesticide type things that have been in. And uh, when we were planning the future, somebody mentioned that they wanted something on food preservation. So I thought, I know somebody that can cover that. So
Absolutely. I mean, and I'm keeping it short and sweet. I don't know how long you guys usually do this. But, you know, I feel like that probably some people are overwhelmed with Zoom meetings at this point. So
I went an hour and a half. So if you keep it short, maybe our average will get back to where it should have been.
okay. Well, and we can always chat and answer questions. So that's great too.
We're glad to have you. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. I feel like everything's been canceled. Like everything that I've liked to do has been canceled. So it's nice to be asked to do something different.
I'm showing exactly 6 o'clock. Maybe we'll give them one more minute and then we can get started if you'd like.
Sure, absolutely. And I guess, Phil, can you monitor the chat box so if people have questions or, I mean, I certainly don't mind if people leave their mics on and just jump in at any point and we keep it a conversation. But if some people would rather feel more comfortable just putting questions in the chat box, you can stop me at any point.
Okay.
A lot of folks that have multiple family members that are watching, and we've gotten feedback a few times from microphones. So we've been muting those, but it's whatever you want to do. We can leave them on. If there starts to be a problem, then we can go in and mute them then.
Yeah, well, yeah, whatever works is fine with me.
All right, I guess we can go ahead and start. And thanks to everybody for tuning in tonight. One of the topics, as I mentioned, that was suggested for one of these daily Zooms was basic food preservation. I know that's something a lot of folks are interested in, and maybe they've done a little bit of it, or maybe they would like to do a little more of it. And I asked Sandy Stoneman. She is our area extension agent for food safety based in Withville, but covers, is there a certain number of counties that you cover, Sandy?
Well, officially they say 6, but I'll be honest with you, I've been, the director has been really kind and I just go where people need me. We're anywhere in Southwest Virginia pretty much.
Well, thanks for tuning in with us tonight and speaking with us, and I'll let you have it.
All right. Well, thank you all for having me and even Phil for thinking of me. I will say before I get started with all of this is that this is usually the time when I do offer a lot of food preservation classes. And of course, when I do these, usually we pick a specific topic and then we end up doing a hands-on, you know, preservation class. And so everybody gets hands-on training and they get to take home documentation with them as well as whatever we've preserved. So trying to do food preservation through a webinar can be a little bit difficult. But so tonight what I've really done is just prepared a kind of a short little slideshow to walk through the different considerations for food preservation, and then also to think about, you know, the types of food preservation that we might want to do at home. And then what my hope is that once we get done, I'll be happy to answer any questions that I can. And then also, you know, if it's something that you all are really interested in, maybe after we get through this whole COVID-19 situation, we can get some actual hands-on classes for up that way, and be able to offer you guys some actual hands-on food preservation training. So, depending on what your interests are. So I will go ahead and get started. And like I mentioned, please feel free to jump in and ask questions. You can do it in the chat box, or you can do it, just open your mic and ask the question. All right. Phil, can you tell me, do you see the first slide?
Yes, I do.
Okay, great. Thank you. I love to show this picture here on this first slide, because this is actually a group of folks from Smith County, and we were canning green beans, and they're showing they're proud of their green beans that we've canned, and so we have, every time we have a hands-on class like this, bonds are formed, friendships are formed, and it really turns into almost like a food preservation party to some extent. But there's some great memories and great stories, and then usually I get repeat visitors because we'll maybe can something different or ferment something different the next time, and then so they'll come back again for another class. So I really just like to encourage people that, yes, anybody can preserve food. So as far as what I want to talk about to you guys about today is really why you would want to preserve food, some of the different methods of food preservation that you might be able to implement at home, selecting foods to preserve, and even thinking about the costs of preserving food. And I will say that I also like to point out that a couple of these pictures they're actually from classes that I have done. So you notice these three young men in the picture in the middle there. I'm actually in a high school teaching a fermentation class, and we're making sauerkraut. So that was a lot of fun. And then the picture in the bottom right, we're actually doing dehydration and making jerky. So lots of fun to be had with different types of food preservation. So why do we preserve food? I mean, why would anybody want to preserve food? Because, we can just go to Walmart and buy it, right? And that's up until recently, that's kind of been a lot of people's attitude. But officially, food preservation started back thousands of years ago. And we used to do it out of necessity. And then some people got out of that habit, and it skipped a few generations. But now more and more people are realizing that food preservation is a skill that it could be very important. So definitely we preserve food so we can extend the shelf life. If we can find a way to preserve it, then we can eat fresh, nutritious food all year round. We might also think about wanting to preserve food just because if we do it ourselves, we know what the ingredients are in that product and the quality of those ingredients. A lot of people do it for personal fulfillment and self-reliance. They just like to be able to provide for their own family and just really enjoy seeing that finished product, on the shelves or in the freezer, depending on what type of preservation they're doing. It can definitely be a bonding experience. I've done situations where, a whole neighborhood would gather and we would talk about and learn about food preservation, and then they would all work on it together. And something that maybe we didn't really think about before, but a lot of folks are having trouble with is finding food. And if you preserve the food while it's in season, then you've got a stockpile for later. And right now, I was just talking with my daughter. She lives outside of Charlotte, and she went to the grocery store, and there's no meat. There's no meat. And we all know that there's a shortage a little bit right now because of the COVID-19 issues in some of the processing plants. And so she's being affected by the shortage. And so, but if she was up here with me in Southwest Virginia, she would have access to my basement and then she would have meat. But I don't really have a way to get that to her. But it really has made us all think about, you know, maybe it is important to have that stockpile for our family, for our friends, for our neighbors, our community. Can you guys, is there anything, any other reason? Sometimes I get people telling me other reasons why they preserve food. So, I mean, if anybody has any suggestions or other add-ins, feel free to jump in there.
This probably goes under the quality thing, but you control the safety of it as far as, you know, anytime there's an outbreak of some foodborne illness like Listeria or something with their lettuce, you know, you don't really hear of that when it's homegrown. So food safety.
That's a very important part, because you know what, if you're doing it for you and your family, number one, especially if it's something you grow, then you're going to know that you have, you know, all the food safety processes you've taken to grow that food. And then you're also going to know that you've taken all the proper steps to preserve it safely as well. And so you don't have to worry about that food being recalled. You know, that's a very good point.
And Sandy, a comment from Aaron down in Scott County was family tradition.
And family tradition, yes. You know, it's been interesting how that's in some of my classes that I will have a grandmother come into class and bring their grandchild, and even I actually even had a grandfather bring his granddaughter. And somewhere along the line, in the midst of the growth of our country, we lost, especially with the urban development, some folks can remember their grandparents preserving food, but they don't have the skills to do it. And they want to reestablish that tradition. And it's really neat to see them doing that with the younger generation as well. Good point.
And Jaquita and Coburn had just commented. She said her family, tradition as well. They've been doing that for generations. And,
you know, those are the people too that I love to have come to class, even though they know probably they know a lot of tricks of the trade. They know how to preserve food in a lot of different ways. But I feel like that every time I have a class, not only am I teaching people, but they teach me. So sometimes I learn tricks from folks that have already been doing this for a long while. All right, so, well, before I go too far into actual food preservation, I want to back up and do a little bit of food science, and I promise it will be short, but you kind of have to understand a little bit about microorganisms and the science and what we've learned about those and how they grow and make us sick in order to make sure that we have that food safety aspect for food preservation. So to understand that a little bit, you guys probably recognize the fight back bacteria guy there. He's with USDA, but I put him up here because what does that bacteria need to grow? Well, in order for bacteria to grow, there's 6 factors that you have to have in place. They need to have a food to grow in. They need to have a certain acidity level or pH range. They also have to have a certain temperature to grow. They need a certain amount of time in order to multiply and grow to a high enough level to make someone sick. And then they usually need some kind of either certain oxygen level. Some need a lot of oxygen, and whereas others are anaerobic and they need very little oxygen. And then they also need a certain amount of moisture in the food to grow as well. So understanding those, that you need those 6 factors in order for them to grow, you can kind of understand that in order to preserve food, we've got to alter one or more of these factors in order to inhibit the bacteria from growing and either A, spoiling our food, or B, growing microorganisms that are foodborne pathogens that can make us sick. So I threw this slide in here I mean, there's definitely other methods of food preservation, but these are the ones that we usually see in the home. And of course, the one we see the most is just cold storage. We store food cold in the refrigerator to preserve it because we know that, you know, it will last longer. We also, the second most common way we preserve food is through freezing. But drying food, acidifying or fermenting foods, using heat processing through canning, all of those are the most common ways that we preserve food at home. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through each one of those and talk a little bit about each one. Now, as far as just cold storage, refrigeration, we know that most biological systems run slower in cooler temperatures. So, I mean, if you think about it, bears hibernate in the winter. Grass doesn't grow in the winter. I mean, everything tends, when it's colder, things slow down. And the same thing is true for our microorganisms, whether it's spoilage microorganisms or foodborne illness microorganisms. What I like for you to realize though, is it cold just slows the growth. It does not kill it. So once you remove it from that cold storage, then the whole process starts up again. Cold storage does help also control the enzyme activity in a food item. It helps slow any kind of browning or breaking down of tissues where things start to get mushy and that kind of thing. So as far as just regular cold refrigerator storage, you need to adjust your refrigerator, and being the food safety person, I highly suggest having some kind of thermometer in your refrigerator to verify it, but adjust it so that it's somewhere between 32 and 40 degrees to help preserve your food just in regular cold storage. If you put it any colder than 32, of course, you're going to have a freezing issue. Now, freezing is a wonderful, quick way to preserve food. Also, with freezing, your nutrition is probably the least affected. You should try to go for faster freezing in order to get the better food product when you thaw it out and get ready to eat it. And then also keep in mind, the lower your freezing temperature, the longer the shelf life of the food item. And I know we got some folks in Kentucky, and you guys probably have some great publications as well, but I did put some links in this presentation to some publications that will go into more detail on freezing or food storage guidelines. And oh, I forgot to mention to everybody that I will have this whole presentation, or I already have it up on my website, and I'll give you that link so that you can actually download it and click on any of the links that I have in it and be able to get all the resources. Now, another way we can preserve food is through drying or dehydration. Drying preserves food by just basically removing the moisture. So we talked about moisture being one of the factors that bacteria need to grow. So by removing moisture from a food that normally has enough moisture for bacteria to grow, then we're doing that preservation. So how can we remove the moisture? Well, way back thousands of years ago, our ancestors just did it in the sun. Sun dehydrating, however, here in Southwest Virginia or in the mountains of Kentucky is probably not going to happen, because you really, in order to dehydrate something in the sun, you need 3 to 4 days of direct sunlight and humidity levels below 20%. And that pretty much excludes most of the US. So in order to actually dehydrate, for us, we've got to use either an oven, which can, I mean, you definitely can do it in the oven. It can just produce sometimes not so reliable results. It can take longer. it is really recommended that you really try out an electric food dehydrator. And these are great tools, and maybe worth the cost if you're going to use them on a regular basis. And again, I put some links here for both dehydrating fruits, vegetables, meats, and also making meat and poultry jerky. Now, I wanted to go into just a little bit more about dehydrators, because you can buy a very affordable dehydrator, online or through your Walmart or whatever, which is usually going to be one that's this vertical, the one at the bottom, this vertical airflow dehydrator. The heating element is in the bottom or the base of the unit. These definitely work, but don't always produce the best quality of product, only because the liquids from the top can drip down into through the racks. Flavors can mix, and then sometimes it can be difficult to clean. But they're a good way to get started affordably and try out dehydration. And then if you really, really like it, you might want to step up and go to a horizontal airflow dehydrator. And these are a little bit more expensive. Some of them are very expensive. But you can get a horizontal airflow dehydrator and try that one out, and it tends to produce a much more quality product, and dries just more equally across the top, because it's blowing the air across the product instead of from the bottom. And then you don't have that flavor mixing, and they also, liquids and all that tend to not drip into the heating unit, and you can actually even line it, and it really does work really, really well. So now let's talk about acidification, or that's usually like where we're either acidifying a certain food item, pickling it, we might be fermenting it. In order to, this is where we're talking about pH. We talked about the bacteria needed a certain acidity level to grow. So when you've got a vegetable that you want to be able to preserve, vegetables in general are just what we call low acid foods. They are foods that have a pH that's really good for bacteria growth. So in order to preserve some of those, so like think about making pickles, taking a cucumber and making a pickle, you need to acidify that cucumber. So you would add vinegar to it. If you're going to preserve tomatoes, because tomatoes tend to be right on the borderline as far as pH. So some tomatoes do grow bacteria pretty good. So then they suggest that you acidify those and add some kind of either citric acid or lemon juice to them to help bring that pH down. So acidifying something is going to be adding some kind of acid to the food to help bring the pH down. Fermentation also has to do with pH and bringing the pH down, but what usually happens with fermentation is that you're adding something to the vegetable to encourage the growth of the good bacteria, the lacto-acid bacteria, while controlling the growth of the bad bacteria and keeping them at bay. And then as that good bacteria grows, if the byproducts that it produces are acidic in nature, and it starts making the pH go down in that vegetable. So that's kind of how fermentation works. You're not really adding an acid, but by controlling and allowing the good bacteria to produce that acid for you, you're making the product more acidic in nature, and it helps control the foodborne illness bacteria. I like to point out that when we're acidifying food, it's very important that we reach the desired acidity in the vegetable all the way through the product. So and that is just as important to safety as it is to the taste and texture. So that's why I really, you're going to hear me say this a couple of times, only use recipes that are tested so that you get the right proportion of acid to your ingredients or your vegetables. And you're not supposed to, I love the quote by Dr. Ben Chapman from North Carolina State. He's a big food scientist, and he says food preservation is not something where you want to be Rachel Ray. You don't want to add your own flair to it or change the recipe. You want to follow a tested recipe to get a safe and good result. The thing about fermentation, you have to be committed to it. It's not something you're going to get done in one day. It does usually take at least 3 weeks, sometimes more like 6 weeks, for the process to actually occur. And again, salt content to vegetables is very important. You want to, don't want to deviate from that. And canning salt is definitely recommended. You don't want to use table salt or, other types of salt. Just good old canning salt is best to help reduce the cloudiness of your final product. Also, container choice is important. I've seen I love a yard sale and buying things at thrift stores and things like that as much as anybody else. I love a bargain. If you've ever worked with Extension, we never have any money because we're a state agency. So we're always looking for a bargain, but buying an old crock, fermentation crock from just someone who doesn't know where it came from and you have no way to trace it to see what the manufacturer was, you want to be careful because some of these old crocks that we have out there do have lead paint. And so you don't want to, risk lead poisoning in your product. And again, I put a link here for vegetable fermentation instructions, a publication that we have here. So now let's move on to canning. Canning is probably the most common food preservation method as outside of refrigeration and freezing that that people really want instruction on. When we are canning food at home, we're using heat. And it's the heat that is going to destroy the microorganisms. It's going to help get rid of the spoilage microorganisms. Depending on what kind of process you're using, you can kill the foodborne illness microorganisms. It helps to inactivate the enzymes that can cause food spoilage. Canning does seal the container to help prevent recontamination. It prevents, because of that seal and the vacuum that it creates when it drives the oxygen off, it prevents moisture loss. So you get a shelf-stable product. So there's 2 types of canning. There's water bath canning, and then there is pressure canning. So the first one I want to talk about is water bath canning. In other words, we're going to use boiling water to process the canned food. So we put the food in the jar, up to a certain level, depending on the size of the jar, put your lid on, put your ring on, and then we put it in the boiling water and process it per the directions for a certain amount of time. And that's boiling water will create that seal and create that vacuum. So for water bath canning, it's only supposed to be used for a food item that is considered an acidic food. So a food that's considered acidic is going to have a pH below 4.6. So in general, that's usually fruits, berries, that kind of thing. Tomatoes and figs tend to be right on the borderline of 4.6, so that's where we'll probably need to acidify those in order to water bath can them. Any kind of fermented product like sauerkraut or fermented vegetable, you could water bath can. And of course, our pickled products. Now, pressure canning uses pressure to help raise the temperature inside the canner to 240 degrees or higher. So why would we need it? You know, I mean, what foods would need to be canned this way? Well, it's all of our vegetables. All of our vegetables tend to be low acid foods. They have a pH greater than 4.6. It's any of the meat, poultry, or seafood products that you might want to can. And then also any mixtures like soups, spaghetti sauce, you know, that kind of thing, where you might have a meat and a vegetable and, you know, liquid all in the same jar. So those would be considered low acid because you're mixing the meats, the vegetables, and even though you might be putting tomatoes in there, the mixture as a whole has a pH that's going to be greater than 4.6. So you would need to pressure can it. So I really, because this is such a food safety important note, I spend a little bit more time on pressure canning because I really want people to think about, well, why, you know what, my grandma has water bath canned her green beans her whole life. Why should I start pressure canning them? Well, it's really all due to one little microorganism, Clostridium botulinum. And you probably heard of this as botulism. Clostridium botulinum is what we call a spore-forming bacteria. By being spore-forming, it can form a protective, heat-resistant cloak, if you want to say, around it and survive extreme temperatures. And so it can survive boiling water temperatures. The only way to kill these spore-forming bacteria is to bring it up to 240 degrees, and that's 240 at sea level. So we'll talk a little bit about what we would do because we're not at sea level here. But you have to understand that botulism is really everywhere in our environment. And people would think, well, why am I not getting sick every day from botulism? It's because botulism only grows in a low oxygen environment. And then as it grows, one of the byproducts of its growth is it produces a toxin, and it's a deadly toxin. And it only takes a minute amount to make you sick. So that's why, even though we probably consume botulism spores every day, we don't get sick because there's oxygen everywhere because it can't grow. But once we put it into a canned food item, and especially if it's a canned food item that has the right, you know, pH, then and it's in that low oxygen environment, it can grow to a high enough level and end up really, really hurting someone. So what are the effects of botulism? First of all, I like people to realize your canned food, if it's canned improperly, can contain botulism and you won't know that it's there. You can't see it, smell it, or taste it. It doesn't make the lid explode off of it. It doesn't bubble. Botulism is virtually invisible. And symptoms usually appear within 12 to 72 hours after eating the toxic food item. And it's going to end up being that you usually may have digestive upset, blurred vision, difficulty swallowing, speaking, and breathing because it actually affects your nervous system. And I mean, most of the time when people die from this, it's because they can't breathe. And the only cure for this, outside of making sure that you do can your food safely and correctly, is to get, if you are exposed to botulism, is to get the antitoxin in time. So you definitely do not want to play Russian roulette with your canned food items. So preventing botulism, now that I've probably scared you to death thinking you're going to get botulism from eating your green beans, the good news is that, you know, if we do things correctly, we really can prevent this from being an issue. In home canned foods, the botulism spores will not germinate in acidic foods. So that's why your acidified foods, your fruits, your jams, your jellies are all safe to water bath can, because they're too acidic, and botulism won't grow in that environment, even if it is a low oxygen environment. The spores can be destroyed if we heat them long enough at a specific temperature. So that's why the USDA says you need to have a pressure canner that can ensure that, used correctly, it will make sure that that product reaches at least 240 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level when you're canning any kind of low acid food like meats or vegetables. And I say here, account for altitude adjustments, because actually, and there are charts that we have, and the recipes will, approved tested recipes will have the altitude adjustments on there, because it might say or run your pressure process for 90 minutes at 10 pounds of pressure if you're at sea level, but it might be 12 or 15 pounds of pressure, where we are, depending on the altitude. So you definitely have to change that. And a lot of people are confused by that. But the higher your elevation, the lower temperature that water boils. So right here where I am in Wytheville, at my altitude, water boils about at 210 instead of 212. So that means I have to use a little higher pressure than my friends over on the coast in order to get my food in my pressure canner up to at least that 240 degree level. So as far as canning goes, I'd say, you really want to make sure that your food that you're going to can, that you properly follow the recipe and you prepare it and process it for the correct amount of time. Canning is not something you can rush. The heat up and cool down times in the recipe are part of the food safety aspect. So you want to make sure you're following that specifically. You also want to make sure your canner is accurate and that you operate it correctly. Make sure that it's in good condition. If you have a gauge canner, you should be able to take that gauge, and we really suggest to the extension office, and that you have it, your gauge tested and calibrated to make sure that it's measuring correctly. Because if it's off by, a couple of pounds of pressure, that could make a difference in whether those botulism spores survive or not. So you really want to make sure that you're using good, up-to-date, accurate equipment. Only use recipes from reputable sources, and that's one thing. Again, this website right here, SWVA Food Safety. That's one I keep updated, and that's where I've got all of my food preservation resources, including this presentation, so you can grab that. In today's times, I get really concerned when I hear people talk about, well, my grandma always did it this way, I'm using her recipe. And grandma's recipe might be perfectly fine. It really might be, but I would compare it to a scientifically approved recipe to verify that it is the same. I do tell people to be very careful about searching the internet for food preservation recipes, just because sometimes people's recipes have not been tested, and by throwing in one ingredient, it could throw off the pH, or their processing time might not be right. So you really want to make sure that you're comparing any recipe that you're going to use to the recipes that have been approved to verify that it's safe. So I've talked about the food preservation aspect at this point. So now I want to talk about what foods to preserve. Well, before we start going crazy and doing a lot of food preservation, I really like to get people to think about, well, what is it that your family eats, and how does your family like to eat it in order to this for you to decide what you really want to spend the time and money on to preserve and maybe even to grow. So after you've decided that, if you're going to grow what you are going to preserve, you want to grow enough of it so that you have enough to actually preserve, you know, because usually you want some to eat now in the summer, but then you want some coming in that you're going to be able to actually take time to preserve. It's important to maybe even stagger that a little bit so that you can harvest that food that you want to preserve at the peak of ripeness, because fresh produce is going to preserve the best. The other thing about that you need to think about is the number one reason why your food tends to not be so great after it's preserved is due to poor handling. You know, the longer it sits after you've picked it, the more nutrients that are lost. So you want to handle your food carefully, you know, pick it with clean hands and get it ready to preserve and get it preserved as close to harvest as possible. They really want you to plan it out and try to get it done within 24 hours for the best quality. Now, some people, you know, don't always grow what they're going to preserve. They might be going to a store or a farmer's market or a local grower and purchasing that food. So again, you want to look for quality. You know, is it the right texture? Does it smell good? If you can and you have access to the grower, ask how fresh it is. Ask when it was harvested, and maybe even, you know, is it local? Is it something? Is that important to you? You know, that you're actually buying something that's, you know, from within a certain parameter of where you live. You know, I've got some people friends of mine who will get you know, suddenly some supermarket will run a sale on pork loins or whatever, and they'll go buy 10 of them, slice and dice them, and can them. And they don't really care that it came from some big slaughterhouse, you know, out west or wherever, but they're doing it because they were able to get a really good buy on it, and then they can preserve it in a way that they know their family will use it later. And so it was able to save them some money. So speaking of money, we should consider the costs. Think about, you know, how much is it going to cost you to produce the food? In other words, are you going to grow it yourself? Are you going to buy it? The equipment and supplies that you might need, you know, do you want to invest in a really nice big pressure canner? Do you want to have a really expensive dehydrator right off the bat if you don't know for sure that it's going to be something that's going to work for you? You also have to consider, you know, it takes electricity usually, water. If you're going to freeze food, you may need to buy a freezer, which is a huge expense or can be a huge expense. And then maybe the most, I guess, to me, a lot of times, I put more emphasis on my time than I do necessarily even the cost. You know, if you're a really busy person, food preservation is not a quick process. It's something that's going to take some time and some planning. And then, you know, just even the whole processing itself is a lot of energy into it. So it is an investment. It's something that you want to consider before you just jump into it if you haven't ever done it before, which is why I love to have a hands-on class, and then that way people can explore their options. Food preservation is a great way for some people to save money. But the thing is for others, it may not be a way to save money, depending on how committed you are to it. The University of Colorado State Extension Office put out a great publication on, they did a study on the costs that it takes to preserve food using the ways that we talked about today. You know, freezing, canning, dehydrating, fermenting, that kind of thing. And so this is a link to their publication. So it's an interesting read if you're kind of wondering which route to go and where you might can jump in for the least amount of money. So that kind of wraps up what I wanted to talk about as far as just kind of covering the bases of food preservation that you might do at home. But keep in mind, I mean, I just skimmed the surface. So I really would like, you know, if you guys I know some of you have done some food preservation, but if you have questions, this is my contact information. Feel free to call me anytime. I don't care what side of the line you live on. I answer everybody's questions. And then this website, swbafoodsafety.org, the resources tab is where you can find this presentation, as well as even some other food preservation links, so that you can go and grab any of those that you might be interested in. So I would ask now, I'm going to close this and stop sharing my screen. And do you guys have any questions or thoughts about, or experiences about your food preservation?
Yeah, Sandy, I don't know if you can see the chat box for now, but there's a question from Aaron. Can you see it there? You want me to-
Yes. If I get a good vacuum seal from just the heat when I make jelly without a water bath, is it shelf stable? Here's where that might be a problem, because you're like, some people, what they'll do is, she's like hot fill hold kind of method. Thank you. I do talk very Southern, don't I? There's a comment. You might be from with you talk like us. What may happen is with the jelly is that you may not be getting it hot enough. I've had some people just say, oh, my jam, it's sealed without me having to put it in the water bath just because you filled it with hot liquid. What'll happen is you may have some spoilage microorganisms like molds and that kind of thing that'll grow. Not necessarily that will be a food safety issue, but what's going to happen is it'll be a spoilage issue that may happen. Does that make sense? Hopefully. By heating that jelly in the water bath canner at boiling temperatures, you're going to end up killing those spoilage microorganisms, and that's why you won't get mold growth in there. Any other thoughts or questions? Oh, okay. And so now they said, can turning it upside down temporarily prevent that? Not in a jam or jelly. Again, it's just because those spoilage microorganisms are found all in that product. And even though, like here, like with a jam or a jelly, a lot of times what you're doing is you're going to boil it on the stove before you fill your jar. And so that normally will kill the majority of the spoilage microorganisms just in making the jam or jelly itself. But in the process of filling the jar, and even, you know, there's a possibility that in the jar, or if you touch it, or if your spoon or your ladle or anything that you're using to fill that jar could have some spoilage microorganisms on it, and therefore then allow those spoilage microorganisms to re-enter the jam and jelly. So that's why to water bath it after you get it into the jar will ensure that there's no spoilage microorganisms left in that jam.
Okay, the Laneys of Coburn had a question about using propane tanks outside to heat the water bath canners.
The propane tanks for water bath canners, first of all, I'll tell you that official guidance says that we we don't like to see propane or canning done outside. And the reason being is that the air movement outside can cause fluctuation in those propane heaters. Now, water bath canning, because hopefully with water bath canning, you're only canning a high acid food item. You're gonna see when you've got that propane cooker out there that the water is boiling. So if you're watching it and the water is boiling and you need it to boil for a certain amount of time, you can visually inspect that and ensure that if there's a gust of air comes and the water quits boiling because the temperature drops, you're going to be able to fix that problem. Where they really do not want you using those propane cookers outside is with a pressure canner, because we have no way a lot of times to really, what happens with the pressure canners, even though you can see the fluctuations in the, maybe on the gauge or hear it in your jiggler if you have a jiggler canner, the fluctuations in temperature can have a much larger impact on the quality and safety of the food. So they would rather you do pressure canning for your low acid foods in a controlled environment. So stovetop, some place where a breeze blowing won't affect the temperature. And so we have a question about maybe doing an in-person class, mailing list. Absolutely. I would be happy if, I don't know if the agents can get me the information of anybody that's interesting. I would be happy to put everybody on a list so that once we get a class scheduled, once we're up and running again, we could actually send that information out to everybody and then, get everybody in for a hands-on class. And by the way, when you're talking to, let me know, are you interested in canning, or do you want to ferment? Do you want to, do you want to do pickles? Do you want to do jams and jellies? Do you want to do meats? I've had some really neat wild game canning classes in the last year that have been a lot of fun, where we've obtained venison, we've done venison, turkey, bear. I heard somebody say there was a bear outside their house or something earlier when I signed in here, and so those are really neat. So like whatever you guys are interested in, if you let your agent know, then we can see what the interest is and make sure we're getting the class that you'd be interested in. Okay, how important is preheating the canning jars? That's really so that when you pour something hot or put something hot into the jar, that it won't explode. So if you're raw, like when I say raw packing, so let's say instead of cooking something ahead of time and then packing the jars, you can also do a raw pack, which means you're just taking the product cold or at room temperature and packing the jar. In that case, you don't really need to preheat the jars, but if you're going to put something hot in that jar, then you want to make sure you preheat it. And I've recently learned to use a pressure canner inside on a gas stove. Suggestions on maintaining temperature without fluctuations. Electric heat stove seems more consistent once the pressure is reached. And it really can be, because the gas stoves, it depends on how, what the equilibrium, I guess, I don't know what the right way to say that is, but for the gas coming into the stove. Also, if there's, if your air handler kicks on, and so, or your air conditioner, and then suddenly there's a breeze blowing through the kitchen, that can definitely be an issue. As long as when you're pressure canning on your gas stove, that your pressure doesn't drop below what it's supposed to, then you've got a safe product. I mean, you don't want it to go way up because you're going to end up over processing, but you want it to be at least so that it doesn't drop below. Why do jars sometimes break out the bottom? Is that a preheating issue? Not always. it really doesn't always have to do with that. I think sometimes we get defective jars. I think like I had a batch of jars, and for some reason, one batch, I had 2 out of a batch of 12 that broke, and literally the bottom dropped out of it. And I just think it was a bad batch of jars. So it doesn't, you don't always know. Sometimes what we see is what can happen is if you screw the lid on too tight, so that then the oxygen can't escape easily out of the jar while it's being processed, it can cause if there's a weak spot in the jar, it can cause it to break, or it can cause the lid to buckle, and you'll see it buckle. So, that's one of the things that it's because the pressure wasn't able to release out of the jar. You just want that, when you screw the lid down or screw the ring down onto the lid, you just want it fingertip tight. You don't really, some of you guys can really ratchet down those rings, and you don't want to do that. You just want it fingertip tight. What's the way to store dried foods? You definitely want it in an airtight container when you've got something that's dehydrated. I see a lot of people putting their jerky in a Ziploc bag, and then it ends up molding. So I really suggest, when you dry a food item, you want to put it in some kind of airtight container, and you really want to use it within, about a week or so of dehydrating it, or put it in that airtight container and then put it in the refrigerator. I've done that with like jerky. Lots of people say that leaving the canning ring on the jar after it seals is a no-no. Others say it's irrelevant. You can do either one. And so it's not a necessity, is what I tell people. You can reuse your rings, but you can't reuse your lids. Lids are only supposed to be used one time. So a lot of folks but you don't want to, after canning, you don't want to remove the ring from the jar until that product has cooled and sat still for 24 hours. They really want you to let it sit, come to room temperature, then remove the ring if you want to and reuse it, and then store your jars away. If you leave the ring on, that's fine. It really shouldn't make a difference if you've got a good sealed product. Anybody have any other thoughts?
Sandy, a question I got from a producer here in Wise County. He makes jams and jellies and sauces with fruits. And a lot of his customers have asked him to cut back on the sugar. And so if he did that, he would probably need to resubmit that recipe and get some insight on to how that's going to affect the acidity. Is that accurate?
Well, and here's where the sugar comes in is you're affecting what we call the water activity. In other words, the moisture that is left in the product for bacteria to grow. The sugar actually binds up the moisture in that fruit. Usually what you're going to end up with is, if you lower the sugar, you're going to end up with maybe a runny product instead of a gelled product. And so that's why, if you really want to lower the sugar, you should follow one of the low sugar recipes, and you can buy the low sugar pectin that you can use it in other words, it gives it the right amount of pectin to sugar to create that lower sugar product.
Okay.
So, but he would still be able to sell those because that falls under the cottage laws. And that brings up a good point. I mean, we could talk on so many different topics here today. I don't know what Kentucky has, but I know in Virginia we have a set of cottage laws that there are certain products we can make out of our home or off our farm and sell them. And then the jams and jellies are one of them. And so as long as they're following, they can definitely label it as low sugar jam or low sugar jelly and still sell it under that cottage law as long as they're following the right recipes. Okay, I did have another question. In light of the altitude, are the weight gauges a problem? No, because what's going to happen is it might say at sea level you should use 10 pounds of pressure, but where we live, use 15 pounds of pressure. And if for some reason it says 12, you just go up to the higher weight gauge. So most of your jiggler weight gauge canners are going to have a 5, a 10, and a 15. So some recipes might say process for 90 minutes for 12 pounds of pressure. At 12 pounds of pressure, well, you can't process at 12 pounds of pressure with a weighted gauge canner. You can only do 5, 10, or 15. So you'd be forced to put the 15-pound weight on to make that work. Are the cottage laws listed on your site? I tell you what, I don't think they are, but I will put them up before I leave today. So I'll get those up there for you guys. And then maybe anybody that's in Kentucky, but who is it? Shad that's from Kentucky.
Chad and Jeremy, and then we've got a couple of folks. Woody is from Harlan County, and Teresa is from Harlan County.
Yes. So do any of you guys know? Does Kentucky have like cottage laws that certain products that they allow them to sell out of their homes?
There are some rules and regulations on some of the cottage laws and stuff like that. And so there has been some legislation crafted over the years, and so there are some things in Kentucky that allows us to do some things, through farmers markets,
Right.
certified roadside stands, that sort of thing. So it may not necessarily open it up, but there's a couple of things there that allow us to be able to put that product out there.
Yeah, maybe start certain food items that are low risk. Usually cottage laws are made and put in place so that low risk food items can be prepared and manufactured and sold through a small business, like a small personal business from a home or through a farm. And usually a lot of times they'll put a monetary limit on it, so you can only sell X number of dollars of product. In other words, if you suddenly become the best raspberry jam maker in Southeast United States and you start shipping this stuff across the state lines, you're going to end up needing a whole different category of rules to fall under. But cottage laws usually allow a small business to be able to get started with some, and for some folks to do some value add type situations through a farmer's market, from a farm and that kind of thing. If I don't know how Kentucky does it, but here in Virginia, all the cottage laws are put out through the Virginia Department of Agriculture. So that's who issues those rules and regulations. So I will definitely get a copy of Virginia's rules and regulations for cottage laws and exemptions up, and I'll put it under that food preservation resources tab, so you guys can find that. Okay, so it says for Kentucky we have a home-based processor and a home-based microprocessor. Okay, and the home-based processor rules changed this year. Yeah, I'm just not certain. And then Shad said he thought that you might have to make them in a certified kitchen. In other words, probably some kind of inspected kitchen. And there are some products that in Virginia that have to come from a certified inspected kitchen as well.
Sandy, in Kentucky, there are some things that you can make. You can make things in a certified kitchen, and we have certified kitchens scattered about the state that allow us to put things, sell them directly, say at a store. That allows us to sell them at a store. It allows them to sell them over the internet. But with the home-based processor and the home-based microprocessor, it's a little bit different. Home-based processor is a deal that everything's the oversight is through basically the Department of Ag, Kentucky Department of Ag. That's an application with the home-based processor. You just fill the application out, You talk about what kind of water you have. It's your water, well water, is your well water tested, so on and so forth. With the home-based microprocessor, it allow those two. You're looking at different products, the low acid, high acid type things. And with the home-based microprocessor, it's a class. I think it's 3 or 4 hours that we teach through extension. And we have, we schedule those, say, in October. We get those on the books. We start teaching those in February and March, and into early April. And then also what we do is we're able to teach those. It's $50 to be able to take the class and get certified in that. For each recipe that you may have, that is sent off to the university, and that's $5 a recipe. And then there's a deal with the KDA that you give them $50 to get the license for a year. So everybody gets some change.
Yep.
But pretty much that's it. Like Woody said, the home-based processor is now $50. It used to be free, and that's pretty much what's going on here in Kentucky. But the certified kitchen, it allows us to be able to market anywhere.
To do more.
If you contact me over the internet and say, I need you to send something to Withful, I can legally send you something.
Right.
This process to a certified kitchen.
Right. And that's very similar to Virginia. We've got kind of some different levels. And like the home-based processor type situation, like what you sound like you're talking about, it has to be sold directly to the consumer, and it's on a very small scale. Whereas the stuff you make in a certified kitchen that actually goes through a inspection process and an application process, that can be like what you were talking about, sold anywhere once you get approved. So I bet it's very similar, maybe slightly different as far as costs and wording, but it sounds very similar.
Sandy, looks like there was a question. I don't think you hit that one.
I may have missed something.
Are there any fruits or vegetables that you recommend not canning? And she was referring to a lot of the homesteading information and so forth that you can find everywhere. That it's
right. And I will say again, everybody loves it. There's a lot of self-reliance going on right now where people are trying, I just did a whole presentation last week on raising backyard poultry, because everybody's, really wanting to find ways to be able to provide for their families without being so reliant on going to a grocery store or from someone else. And so I would really suggest there definitely, I know some people want to do canned pumpkin as like pureed pumpkin. And that is something that because of its density, there's no approved recipe for that. You can do cubes, but you can't do the pureed. I have had one person who actually wanted to be able to can and sell their pumpkin butter. And in order to do that, they had to develop a recipe, and then in order to sell it, they had to pressure can it and then have that whole product and recipe verified through the Food Innovations Program at Virginia Tech, which is basically the process authority that proves whether that product is safe or not. But there is no home recipe for canned pureed pumpkin at this point. So that's kind of the one I get more often than any other. But I would be careful, like if you come across a recipe that you think you want to use from the internet, maybe from a homesteading resource, or maybe a family member, that kind of thing, take it and compare it to a tested recipe from the National Center for Home Food Preservation or the USDA. And I put those resources on the website so that you can actually find the links to all those, so that you can, have a place to go and and at least make sure that what you're trying to do is a safe, approved process. Were there any other questions I missed?
That's all I saw. Are there any questions for Sandy? Any more?
Really good job.
Well, thank you for having me. And then, and like I said, get your information to these agents, and I'd be happy to come up and do a class once we get hands-on stuff, or if there's anything else that you're interested in that I can help you guys with, just let me know. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Everybody have a great evening, and we'll see you tomorrow. What's on the agenda tomorrow?
Dragonflies and damselflies, I think. Could be Chris Allgaier again.
All right. Sounds great. Everybody tune back in tomorrow, and we'll see you around 6 o'clock.
See you
All
guys.
right.
Bill, Shad, I'll see you guys in the morning about 9 o'clock.
All right. See you then.
All right. Y'all have a good evening.